Airspace is a daunting subject, but with a few helpful hints, we can make it pretty easy to understand. This video is meant to supplement your Blackboard material and text to understand the finer points of airspace. There are 7 types of airspace in the United States: A, B, C, D, E, G, and special use. Airspace is a 3-dimensional resource. However, maps and depictions are only displayed in 2 dimensions, often making this confusing. We have to train ourselves to think 3-dimensionally. Of particular interest are operations near airports. That's the most restrictive airspace because there's the highest likelihood of a mid-air collision. This is why the FAA has stricter regulations in that area. One concept around airports where there's often confusion is the concept of shelves in some classes of airspace near an airport. This is where our 3D thinking comes into play. Let's review some of the maps and annotations to help us navigate airspace. I think it's important to see that up to 25% of the remote pilot examination is about airspace. Also, airspace affects aspects of the regulations, weather, and operations. You must understand airspace thoroughly to safely operate your UAS. Your Blackboard course, including course packs, web references, text, and videos, provide very detailed information. For this introductory discussion, we're going to do a high-level review of some items we need to understand about aeronautical maps. The first are airport, airspace, and topography depictions. Blue is for towered airports. The line depicts the runway configuration and the runway direction. Non-towered airports are magenta. You will note other depictions that give specific information, such as military or civilian use, services available, and whether the runway is verified as usable. The next important area is airport information. There is more detail in your Blackboard course, but you can see by this information on the legend that an aeronautical chart provides a lot of information about an airport. Airspace types are also listed, including the color of airspace boundaries. Obstruction information is very important. Obstructions may be an antenna, a mountain peak, a group of obstructions, a tall building, or other hazards to navigation. The 2 altitude descriptions that you will often hear used are MSL, or mean sea level, and AGL, or above ground level altitudes. The AGL altitude is reported in parentheses and is either the final height of the obstruction or the last verified height. Your text explains MSL and AGL in detail, but in general, if MSL is the altitude above sea level, then AGL is the altitude above the ground. Pilots navigate using MSL because it's based on an altimeter setting and readings. So as an example, in Denver, often referred to as the Mile High City, on the ground, the altimeter will read about 5,000 feet. AGL is the altitude above the ground at your current location. To determine the MSL terrain elevation, you subtract the AGL altitude from the MSL altitude. So in this case, the MSL elevation for the obstruction is 2,049 feet, and the AGL height of the obstruction is 1,149 feet. 2,049 minus 1,149 leaves 900 feet, indicating the terrain is 900 feet MSL. You can see that there's a lot of information, but don't be overwhelmed by every symbol. This introduction is only meant to help you to begin to connect the dots between the areas that you are studying: airspace, regulations, weather, and operations. Here's an example of Class C airspace, which is near Northwest Arkansas Regional Airport, along with depictions of Class D airspace. near Springdale Municipal and Rogers Municipal airports, and Class E airspace surrounding Bentonville, Louise Thaden Municipal Airport. You'll also notice that there's some weather moving into the area from the west, shown in green. In the weather video, we will discuss aeronautical decision-making based on weather, but you must also understand the three-dimensional aspect of airspace to make good aeronautical decisions. Whether you fly under Part 107 as a remote pilot or as a hobbyist, you must know where you are flying to know if you must obtain a written waiver or if you must notify air traffic control and the airport. The FAA Before You Fly app is helpful, but it only is depicted in 2 dimensions. You must still use other tools to understand the 3 dimensions of airspace. Let's say, for example, you have a commercial job here. Can you do it? What do the 2,500 and 5,300 annotations mean? As you may recall from your airspace sections, Class A is where jets and large aircraft fly. Only a few small military UAS can fly with manned aircraft there. Class B surrounds our busiest airports with mandatory radar service. Class C are busy controlled airports with radar service, while Class D airports have a control tower. Class E airspace is generally for uncontrolled airports, which means they have no tower, while Class G airspace is for the rest of the country. The airspace classes are represented in 2 dimensions on the previous chart, but many students find that thinking of Class B and C airspace as an upside-down wedding cake helps them visualize the 3-dimensional aspect. As we look at the airspace from the side, it helps us understand the 3D picture. We see there's a place where we can fly in this area. This is important as we try to learn where it's legal. Let's try some application. Referring back to our map, we see that the shelf is divided in this area and the floor is 2,500 feet MSL. It's important to understand the maps are in mean sea level, but the rules are typically written in AGL or above ground level. So as we look at this area, we must determine the field elevation or the ground elevation to know where we can fly. Assuming there aren't any other restrictions, we can fly up to 400 feet AGL. We see the obstruction near the launch area by the star is about 1,472 feet MSL, with an annotation in parentheses of 260 feet AGL. By subtracting 260 from 1,472, this leaves us 1,212 feet MSL. The highest altitude we may fly in the area is 400 feet AGL. If we add the field elevation of 1,212 MSL, we see the MSL altitude we may not exceed is 1,612. Since 1,612 feet MSL is less than or below the 2,500 foot shelf, we can fly in this area. It's important to note that we may fly over an obstruction as long as we remain within 400 feet of the obstruction. So if we were inspecting the tower, perhaps this one, that's 1,472 feet, we could fly 400 feet above the antenna, which is 1,872 feet MSL. Since 1,872 feet MSL is less than or below 2,500 feet MSL, we can operate safely and legally in this area. It's important to note that near antennas, there are guide wires and other structures that may be considered for safety. In order to be safe, legal, and professional, you need to understand how airspace designations interact, the regulatory requirements, how to read weather and maps, and how to synthesize these into a plan of action. The key to successful flights in your UAS are to carefully plan the mission and make sound aeronautical decisions based on all of these areas. That includes all these areas that we covered today. Types of airspace, how to think in 3 dimensions, operations near airports, regulations to fly in or under shelves, and maps and annotations.